the first thing people noticed was not a statement. It was the silence. Not the polished kind the royal world knows how to wear so well. Not the elegant, practiced silence that comes with palace gates, neat hedges, and carefully timed appearances. This felt different. Heavier. Stranger. The kind that makes people stop mid-scroll and think, wait, what is going on here? By early 2026, that silence seemed to be spreading far beyond royal walls. It reached California. It reached London. It reached the media rooms, the comment sections, the group chats, and the private calls between people who follow the royal family like it is both a national institution and a never-ending family drama. And at the center of it all was Meghan Markle, once again surrounded by whispers, second guesses, and the familiar feeling that the public story and the private one were no longer lining up. Something had shifted, and even people who usually dismiss royal gossip as background noise could feel it. Let's talk about what really happened. For years, Meghan's image had been built around reinvention. Actress. Advocate. Outsider. Duchess. Then exile, depending on who was telling the story. She had become one of those public figures people rarely felt neutral about. Supporters saw strength, cruelty survived, and a woman trying to keep control in a system designed to flatten individuality. Critics saw calculation, performance, and a brand that always seemed one interview away from another version of the truth. That divide had existed for years. But this particular moment felt sharper. Because now the whispers were not just about old interviews, family tension, or another media cycle built on royal resentment. They were circling around deeply private territory, the kind of territory that makes even seasoned reporters lower their voices. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal that what began as scattered murmurs soon turned into a bigger conversation about trust, image, and whether the public had ever been shown the full story at all. And that was enough to make people lean in. Not because anyone had clear proof. Not because the facts were neatly tied up. But because in royal stories, certainty is rare. It is the gaps that pull people in. The pauses. The corrections. The moments when nobody says much, and somehow that says everything. In Montecito, what had once looked like a carefully managed second act no longer felt steady. The media projects, the lifestyle rebrand, the soft-focused storytelling, the carefully framed appearances, all of it suddenly looked less like confidence and more like maintenance. As if something had to keep being held in place. And when a public image starts looking like hard work, people begin asking why. Many are questioning how a couple who once seemed to have mastered modern celebrity now appear trapped by the very attention they worked so hard to control. What many people don't know is that this story was never only about headlines. It was also about atmosphere. The mood around them. The people who stayed. The people who quietly left. The advisors who stopped appearing. The once loyal glow of celebrity backing that did not seem as bright anymore. These stories provide insight into how public image can weaken long before it actually breaks. Then came the detail that made even casual observers pause. Reports began circulating that more than 18 senior staff members had left the wider Sussex orbit by early 2026. Some departures were explained. Some were not. Some were framed as routine. Others felt anything but routine. In a world built on loyalty, discretion, and message discipline, that many exits do not just create paperwork. They create a mood. And moods are dangerous when a narrative is already under strain. One departure can be written off. Two can be explained away. A long pattern is something else entirely. It makes people wonder what daily life is really like behind the gates, beyond the interviews, beyond the brand language, beyond the soft music and carefully chosen words about healing, purpose, and service. Because people do not keep leaving places that feel calm, clear, and stable. That is the kind of sentence people were saying quietly in newsrooms and on private calls. On this particular occasion, the story widened because it was no longer just about Meghan herself. It became about the system around her. The people managing the message. The people trying to contain rumor. The people deciding when to respond and when to say nothing at all. And in royal stories, containment often becomes the story. That is when another layer started to form. The royal family has always understood that silence can be protective. It can also be strategic. But in the modern media world, silence does not end a story. It feeds it. Especially when public curiosity has already moved into sensitive ground. A refusal to comment does not close a chapter anymore. It becomes its own chapter. Whispers grew louder. Was this about old tensions resurfacing? Was it about new private battles becoming impossible to hide? Was it about reputation management collapsing under years of strain? Or was it simply another case of the internet doing what it does best, taking fragments, suspicions, and timing, then building a drama bigger than the evidence? That question sat at the heart of everything. And nobody seemed able to answer it cleanly. Meanwhile, public appearances kept coming, but they landed differently. What once might have been seen as polished now felt overworked. What once looked confident now felt guarded. Every speech, every launch, every photo opportunity began carrying the extra weight of interpretation. People were no longer just watching what Meghan said. They were watching what she did not say. How she looked. Who stood beside her. Who did not. That is how royal mythology works now. Not through declarations. Through mood. And the mood around this story had turned cold. Still, none of that was the most striking part. The most striking part was how many people suddenly seemed willing to revisit old timelines, old relationships, and old versions of Meghan's story. People who had once accepted the polished arc, the outsider walking into a brutal institution, were now asking whether the story had always been more complicated than that. Not necessarily darker, but more managed, more selective, more carefully arranged for public consumption. That is what made this moment feel bigger than another gossip cycle. It was not one rumor. It was the feeling that the frame itself was cracking. And once that happens, every old detail returns wearing a new face. To understand why this story landed with such force, you have to go back before the Duchess title, before the wedding spectacle. Before the transatlantic interviews and the documentaries and the speeches about pain, truth, and survival. Back to the earlier version of Meghan. Back to Toronto. Los Angeles. Auditions. Industry rooms. Networking dinners. Small upgrades. Better circles. Better visibility. The kind of life where ambition is not a dirty word, but it is also never worn openly. In those worlds, people notice who is moving upward, who is changing social lanes, who is becoming more polished by the year. According to journalists who covered her early rise, Meghan was not seen as lazy, confused, or passive. She was seen as focused, thoughtful about presentation, careful about access. A woman who understood that in public life, story matters almost as much as achievement. That is not a crime. But it does become important later. Because once she entered royal life, the public version of her story often leaned heavily on innocence. On surprise. On emotional sincerity. On the idea that she stepped into this old, frozen world with openness and got punished for it. That version resonated with many people because it felt emotionally true, even when the facts around it were often debated. But emotional truth and factual clarity are not always the same thing. And that gap is where royal stories thrive. Whispers about careful self-positioning followed Meghan long before she met Prince Harry. Not loud whispers. Not proven ones. The kind that live in elite circles and media memory. People recalling how she studied rooms. How she understood influence. How she moved with intention. Society insiders report that some of those early impressions later became part of the skepticism around her. Not because ambition is unusual, but because royal culture still pretends to admire destiny more than design. That tension mattered. Because the monarchy loves romance. The public loves authenticity. And critics love finding the seam where both may have been edited. Then came the fairy tale phase. The courtship. The fascination. The wedding that was sold globally as modern monarchy finding a new face. For a while, that story was powerful enough to drown out almost everything else. The glamour helped. So did the symbolism. So did the contrast between old palace formality and Meghan's polished California confidence. But royal insiders remember that even in the early glow, there were warning signs. Not the huge dramatic ones people write in hindsight. Smaller things. Tension around staff. Different expectations. Different instincts about hierarchy, press handling, and who owed what to whom. Palace worlds run on codes that are ancient, petty, and brutally strict. Celebrity worlds run on control, speed, branding, and personal narrative. Put the two together and friction is almost guaranteed. That friction did not stay small for long. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal a pattern: public warmth, private strain, repeated reports of communication breakdowns, and growing complaints from people inside the machine. Some defended Meghan fiercely, saying she was being judged by old rules designed to protect the institution, not the individual. Others said the bigger issue was temperament, pressure, and a style of leadership that created anxiety around those working nearby. Either way, the pattern kept returning. And when patterns return often enough, they stop looking random. That was one of the first real warning signs. Then came the exit. The break with royal life was framed as freedom. New country. New contracts. New voice. New control. In California, the couple seemed to believe they could build something larger than the institution that had defined them. They would tell their own story, on their own terms, and finally escape the palace game of silence, hierarchy, and selective protection. At first it worked. Or at least it looked like it worked. There were deals, headlines, prestige platforms, celebrity support, carefully lit interviews, emotional disclosures, and a strong market for royal truth-telling. The brand of pain had commercial value. The image of survival had cultural power. They were not just royal defectors. They were symbols. But brands built on revelation have a hidden problem. Sooner or later, people ask what is left to reveal. And once audiences start feeling that the story is repeating itself, sympathy becomes less stable. The same confession that once felt brave can start to feel rehearsed. The same emotional honesty can begin to sound managed. The same image of victimhood can weaken if every conflict still points back to the same unresolved feud. That is where the cracks began to show. The professional projects became uneven. Some landed. Some stalled. Some drew attention for the wrong reasons. By mid-2025, Meghan's lifestyle venture was supposed to mark another reinvention: elegant, aspirational, controlled. Instead, it invited criticism. Commentators called it vague. Overpriced. Too polished to feel warm. Too personal to feel professional. Then came talk of rushed rebranding, visual similarities to existing emblems, and the awkward sense that even her comeback had entered the world surrounded by questions. It was not one failure. It was cumulative fatigue. And that fatigue changed how the public processed everything else. So when older whispers resurfaced in 2026, they landed in a different environment. An environment where fewer people were willing to give the polished version the benefit of the doubt. An environment where staff departures, brand trouble, celebrity distance, and royal silence had already created the feeling that something behind the scenes was not holding together. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Not a formal accusation. Not a single headline. Just the growing sense that private history, long buried under public messaging, was drifting back into view. And once that started, people began looking at the entire story differently. On this particular occasion, the crisis did not explode all at once. It gathered. First as whispers. Then as patterns. Then as a kind of nervous energy moving through media circles, royal watchers, and people close enough to the story to know when something was off but not close enough to say so openly. That is how big royal scandals often begin now, Not with one dramatic reveal, but with a change in tone. By early 2026, the tone had changed completely. The departures around the Sussex household were no longer being treated as isolated staffing choices. The silence between London and California felt less like distance and more like hard separation. Public appearances seemed increasingly solo in spirit, even when they were not technically solo in schedule. Every small sign of emotional distance was being tracked, discussed, and exaggerated in real time. Then a more sensitive set of whispers entered the conversation. They touched on deeply personal territory, private health, family narratives, old timelines, things no responsible outlet could cleanly confirm. But that still moved fast because of who was involved and because the monarchy has always carried an extra layer of public obsession when it comes to legitimacy, heirs, and family continuity. That is when the story became genuinely volatile. Not because the claims were proven, because they were intimate enough to be damaging even in rumor form. Once a public story crosses into private medical territory, there is no clean way to control it. Legal teams understand that. Advisors understand that. Journalists understand that too, which is why so much of the coverage around this period leaned on careful wording, unnamed sourcing, and atmosphere instead of direct assertion. Still, the effect was the same. The public could feel that something highly sensitive had entered the room. And when highly sensitive things enter royal stories, the institution stiffens. Reports suggested that communications tightened. Language became more cautious. Responses, when they appeared at all, felt thinner and more strategic. The absence of direct engagement only made the subject feel hotter. People assumed there must be more to hide simply because the reaction looked so disciplined. That is the trap of reputation management. The more controlled the response, the more uncontrolled the speculation becomes. Meanwhile, outside the formal statements, another drama was unfolding. Meghan's broader image was being hit from several directions at once. Her commercial reinvention was still under pressure. Celebrity allies who once seemed loudly present were quieter. Industry enthusiasm felt cooler. Even the old victim versus institution frame, once emotionally powerful, seemed less secure than before. Many are questioning how someone so skilled at narrative building suddenly looked unable to stabilize her own. The answer may be simpler than people think. A person can manage a headline. A person can manage an interview. A person can even manage a season of bad press. What becomes much harder to manage is convergence. When staffing issues, family tension, brand trouble, old rumors, public fatigue, and private hurt all begin landing at the same time. Then the story no longer feels like a media problem. It starts to feel like a life under visible strain. That was the real crisis. Not one claim. Not one leak. The accumulation. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal that this period was marked less by dramatic confrontation and more by procedural panic. Conversations routed through teams. Responses measured against risk. Words reviewed again and again before release. In other words, the kind of environment where everyone becomes cautious because nobody is sure what might surface next. And in cautious environments, even normal events look suspicious. A missed appearance becomes a sign of conflict. A solo engagement becomes a sign of separation. A delayed launch becomes a sign of collapse. A quiet legal review becomes a sign that disaster is close. Sometimes those interpretations are wrong. Sometimes they are only partly wrong. But once public trust weakens, every silence turns symbolic. That spring, attention sharpened again when King Charles visited the United States. Some observers hoped for thawing. For a private meeting. Even a photo that might suggest old family wounds were healing. None came. No reunion. No softening. No visible bridge. The absence landed harder than any statement could have. Because it reinforced the bigger emotional truth of the moment. Whatever this family had once been trying to repair, it was no longer trying in public. The gaps had hardened. The silence had become structure. For Meghan, that likely made everything worse. Because the personal and the public had become inseparable. Every rumor now touched not just reputation, but belonging. Not just image, but exclusion. Not just brand, but identity. And once someone begins to feel that every headline is part of a larger pattern, even ordinary setbacks can start to feel coordinated. That perception matters, whether or not it is accurate. It shapes decisions. It shapes tone. It shapes how people carry themselves when they know the cameras are watching for weakness. The fallout was not loud. It was colder than that. More procedural. More isolating. More exhausting. There were no dramatic palace balcony scenes. No public showdowns. No cinematic confessions. Just a slow, unpleasant feeling that the story had entered a phase where nobody could fully stop it, nobody could fully prove it, and nobody could fully move on from it. That is what made it dangerous. The full truth was still to come, but by then one thing was already obvious. The old version of the Sussex story, hopeful, rebellious. Emotionally clear, no longer fit the moment people were watching unfold. Something more complicated had taken its place. And once the public senses complication, it rarely asks for less. It asks for everything. The truth, in stories like this, is rarely one neat revelation. It is usually a mess of overlapping realities. There is the official version. The emotional version. The version told by friends. The version told by critics. The version that comes from staff, from journalists, from old acquaintances, from people who insist they know what happened and people who truly believe they do. Then there is the version shaped by timing, repetition, and public appetite, the one that becomes real not because every detail is proven, but because enough people start treating it like the hidden explanation behind everything else. That seems to be what happened here. Not a single explosive disclosure. A gradual collapse of certainty. Accounts from witnesses reveal a climate where multiple problems began reinforcing one another. Staff turnover fed rumors of instability. Brand struggles fed questions about judgment. Royal silence fed suspicion. Emotional distance fed stories of separation. Old private whispers, once too sensitive to gain traction, suddenly found a public ready to revisit them through a much harsher lens. That is the complete picture. Not confirmation of every rumor, but confirmation that the environment around Meghan had become deeply unstable. And in that kind of environment, the public stops distinguishing cleanly between fact, inference, and mood. What many people don't know is that public reaction to this kind of story often says as much about the audience as it does about the person at the center. Meghan has long functioned as a cultural mirror. To some, she represents the punishment of a woman who refused to stay grateful and quiet. To others, she represents modern image-making pushed too far, where branding, therapy language, and selective vulnerability blur into performance. That is why every new chapter becomes bigger than itself. Because people are not just reacting to Meghan. They are reacting to class, race, fame, power, celebrity feminism, media cruelty, monarchy, American self-invention, and the old British obsession with who gets to belong. So when this period of intense scrutiny arrived, the world responded in predictable, but still revealing ways. Supporters argued that the cruelty had simply changed shape. The palace no longer needed to attack directly. Public suspicion would do the work for them. Critics said the opposite, that sympathy had finally thinned because too many inconsistencies had piled up over time. Both sides saw pattern. Both sides claimed insight. Neither side could fully close the argument. That is why the story kept breathing. Not because people had definitive answers. Because the uncertainty itself had become addictive. And yet behind all the commentary, there was a much simpler human truth. Living inside years of scrutiny changes people. It narrows them. Hardens them. Makes every mistake feel larger and every silence feel dangerous. A person under that much projection is no longer just managing events. They are managing interpretations of events, interpretations of motives, interpretations of moods. That is exhausting even for ordinary people. For public figures, it can become a permanent condition. The aftermath of this chapter did not bring dramatic closure. It brought something more familiar to modern royal life: continued ambiguity. The marriage, whether united or strained, remained subject to projection. The business projects continued, but under heavier doubt. The relationship with the royal family remained frozen in a way that now seemed less temporary than structural. The celebrity world around Montecito looked thinner, less enchanted, less eager to attach itself to another cycle of emotionally expensive drama. That too tells a story. Because applause does not usually disappear all at once. It fades. First the loud endorsements vanish. Then the easy public support. Then the feeling of momentum. Then the assumption that every reinvention will work just because the cameras are still there. When silence replaces applause, people start understanding how fragile public myth really is. And Meghan's myth, whatever one thinks of her, had always been unusually dependent on control of narrative. Once that control weakened, everything became harder. The larger implication is not only about one woman, or one marriage, or one royal dispute. It is about the strange bargain public figures make with visibility. They offer access, shape a story, and hope the story will protect them. But access also creates appetite. Once people are trained to expect revelation, they do not stop asking for more simply because the next layer is private. That is one of the cruelest parts of fame. The boundary keeps moving. And sometimes, long after the interviews are over and the brand has changed again and the official silence has settled in, the public is still standing there, waiting for the version that feels final. Maybe there is no final version. Maybe that is the real lesson. That in modern royal life, truth is rarely destroyed by one scandal. It is worn down by repetition, selective storytelling, distrust, and the endless collision between what is lived privately and what must be sold publicly. These stories provide insight into how power protects itself, how celebrity reshapes memory, and how silence can function as both shield and wound. In the end, the most revealing detail was never one rumor or one headline. It was the feeling that everyone involved had stopped speaking the same language of truth. And once that happens, the story does not end. It just becomes harder to contain.